Welcome to the HawkCast with your host, AJ Hawk.
Perry Marshall joins me. Perry, I don't even know where to start with you when I have intellectuals like you on. It's almost like you do so many different things. But one thing I always wonder, you're an author, you've written some great books, but do you have it? Is there any crossover between your book, like Evolution 2.0 you have, and then you write a lot on Google and Facebook ads and how like direct mail, like all of this ad work? How do you cross in both of those worlds and write books about both of them?
Well, that is an amazingly good question, because they actually all connect. It's almost like, it's like there's these, 3 trees growing on your property, but somehow down under the ground, the roots all intertwine, 30 feet below. And so just so people have some idea of who Perry is, I'm best known as the guy who wrote the book on Google advertising, which is the world's best-selling book on internet advertising. And Google advertising, for that matter, is probably the biggest thing to happen in advertising in the last 50 years. I mean, it completely revolutionized advertising. It democratized advertising. And so anybody, you could put $5 in the machine and whack your credit card and start buying clicks to your website, and you didn't have to pay until somebody actually clicked to see who you are and what you're about, right? So that Google came out in 2002 with their advertising program, and that just basically it brought law and order to the wild west of the internet. And you could put $1 in and get a customer out, put $1 in and get a customer out. And anybody that runs a business, that's just revolutionary. Well, okay, so I did that, and then we came out with the Facebook advertising book, which is the most popular book of its kind. Well, but then there's a couple of other. So I have an 80-20 book. Well, what's that about? Well, the 80-20 principle is the number one law of cause and effect, but hardly anybody knows this. Hardly anybody knows that pretty much 20% of all causes produce 80% of all effects, and 20% of the people own 80% of the money, and 20% of the landowners have 80% of the real estate. Well, that was actually the secret to all of the Google and Facebook stuff. That was the underlying principle under that. Now, so then there's a couple of other threads. In a previous life, in a previous career, I wrote a book called Industrial Ethernet, which would only be good for sleeping for most people. Like if you're having trouble sleeping, if you have insomnia, you can buy Perry's Industrial Ethernet book for like $80 on Amazon. And it will help, I'm sure. So that, that was part of my life. And then there's the Evolution 2.0 book. Well, it actually has everything to do with Ethernet, because what I discovered was that the data in DNA is almost identical to the data in an internet packet. Okay, if you drew a diagram, so you're talking on your cell phone, or your kids in the back seat on their iPad and they're watching videos while you drive down the expressway, there's these packets of information that are coming in from the cell phone tower or from your Wi-Fi or from whatever, and they are very, very precisely formatted. It's like, okay, so the sending address and the receiving address and all these blocks of data, and it all has to come perfectly, or else, your video screws up, or your cell phone call gets dropped. And what I realized was, hey, wait a minute. DNA, if you looked at your genes and chromosomes and the things in your DNA, it's the same thing. And I realized that, well, actually, this is a huge key. Because I get sucked into the creation evolution argument with my brother, who is in the process of going from missionary to atheist, which almost happened. And so I get sucked into this thing, and like, how do I ever figure this out? I mean, this is a hugely complicated topic. And what I discovered is like, well, because you wrote an Ethernet book, you actually can figure this out, because genetics and information technology are very, very, very similar. Well, okay, so what does this have to do with advertising? Well, what it has to do with advertising is the evolutionary process is the same in advertising as it is in biology. It's almost exactly the same. Okay, if you so you're a plumber and you advertise on Google, you bid on the word stopped up toilet in Chicago, Illinois, and you bid $3.40 a click. It might cost more than that. I don't know how much that keyword costs, but you bid on all these keywords, right? So somebody sees your ad and they click on it and they come to your website. Well, there's all these plumbing companies that are competing. Well, the ads that get clicked on the most get charged the least amount of money per click because Google wants the most clicks. Google is going to reward the person that makes them the most money, and ads that get clicked on make money, and ads that don't get clicked on don't make money. Okay. Mm-hmm. And so what you have is what they call in biology, it's called natural selection, right? Is most of them die and a few of them succeed. Well, so you test ads, you write ad A and ad B, and you see if ad B can beat ad A. Well, this is how organisms evolve, and they don't do it accidentally. And this is the whole point of my evolution book, is that if you read a typical textbook or you go to Barnes and Noble and you buy an evolution book from the typical authors, what they all tell you is that there's just these random copying errors in genes, and then occasionally a copying error is better, and then the falcon can see better, and then the falcon outlives the other falcons. That isn't true. Okay, it's half true. What's really going on is the cells are cutting, splicing, editing their DNA, and they're actually testing things out, just like people do on Google AdWords. And this has been documented for 70 years, but nobody was really talking about it. And I said, oh my goodness, this is the biggest untold story in the history of science. So all of my books they're all about digital communication. They're all about 80-20. Okay. And they're all about communication, competition, and 80-20. All of those books are about those things. And so it actually, and people, the people that get my evolution book the most are one of two people. They're either engineers because they get the engineering part of it, or they're entrepreneurs because as they read that book so they're reading about how you take antibiotics and then the bacteria mutate to try to evade the antibiotics. Like if you don't kill those suckers dead, they are coming back with a vengeance, and they will be worse. And then you will have a real problem. You will go to the hospital and the doctor will say, we only have one antibiotic left that might work, and if this doesn't work, you're dead. This conversation actually happens every day somewhere. Okay, well, those bacteria are doing what we do as entrepreneurs. So people read about this and they're like, oh my goodness, this is my life. I live this every day, right? And you played football. Look, what's more competitive than that, right? How many high schools, right? And then how many colleges and all the recruiting. My daughter's boyfriend works for a company that helps. They sell coaching programs for parents who want to get their kids into the best sports programs, right? So he's talking to parents whose kids are in sports. It's all competitive, right? All the reality TV shows and stuff, right? So this is these are the secrets of the universe. And so whether you approach it from biology or engineering or marketing, it's actually all the same set of principles. And I love principles because if you know principles, you don't have to memorize 100,000 things. You know one principle and you know that it works.
Well, I like how you tie it all together. I would never think that all of those are kind of intertwined like you described it, but there's a million questions I have just off that. But one of the first one that pops up into my head, what made your brother, was there a pivotal point that when he was training to be a missionary where he almost became an atheist? What happened?
Well, so he went to a seminary, a super conservative Christian seminary in the West Coast. And by the way, we grew up in Nebraska. Our dad was a pastor, super conservative. And my path, when I say conservative, I mean like really conservative.
Like
okay,
Footloose. It was Kevin Bacon. Footloose, was it that the town that they can't dance? Have you seen it?
Sort of like that, except in the north. So that's like the southern version.
Okay.
The northern version is just to give you an idea. When I was 12, my mom went bipolar, and our whole family was bedlam. Like, if you've ever had a relative who's manic depressive, and man, it was crazy. Except nobody knew what was going on. All we knew was mom's just acting crazy. Okay. And dad's pulling his hair out, and we're like, you come home from school and we're arguing all the time. Like, the arguments would start at 3:30 in the afternoon and they would go until bedtime.
With your mom, or between your mom and dad?
Well, like mom and everybody. It was mom against everybody.
How many siblings?
Okay?
How many are there total?
So I've got a brother and a sister, and then my dad. So there's 5 of us. And and so this went on. So dad's like flailing around trying to figure out what's going on. He finally took her to a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist correctly diagnosed her as bipolar with mild schizophrenia. Ooh. This is in 1983. He prescribed this kind of horrendous medication called Haldol, which it just killed the craziness. It also kind of almost sedated her, but all of a sudden it went away. But it took a couple weeks for this to work out. As soon as the people at the church heard that dad took mom to a psychiatrist, they demoted him and publicly shamed him for, because they thought psychiatrists were guys that, we know that the real problems in the world is sin and rebellion. And those guys are just trying to make excuses for all this stuff and give you pills and stuff. And so it was horrible. And actually what happened, it was like right out of the horror stories from abusive churches playbook.
Did they think that she should just pray her issues away, or
yes,
there's no,
exactly.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. If you would read your Bible and submit to authority, this is lunacy. She has a psychiatric disorder. Well, the short story is my dad stuck it out and he vindicated himself. So for a while, it was just crazy chaos and nobody could tell what was going on. But then she got on medication, got the problems under control. Started fine-tuning things. Her behavior completely changed, and he went to his boss and he said, "You were totally wrong about this. What you did was completely wrong. You need to apologize to my wife." And he got himself reinstated. He basically won his honor back. Nice. Which is a huge. This is going on when I was about 14 years old, and this is a huge lesson. He didn't turn and run. He faced the problem. He was actually the only guy in the board of elders that had the balls to stand up to the man. So the man was, very powerful, very influential. There's about 2,000 or 3,000 people in this church. Now, a lot of people, they would take a situation like that and they go, "Oh, those hypocrites," and they would just walk away from it. Well, what I realized was this was just another version of if you read the New Testament, Jesus is battling religious hypocrites all the time. Okay. In fact, that's the whole story. It's Jesus against the religious hypocrites. And so, I didn't abandon faith because of this. I just realized that this religious hypocrisy is insidious and it kind of leaks into everything and nobody's immune. But so this gives you an idea of where we grew up. So I moved to Chicago and I took a more moderate route. I'm like, you know what? I'm going to find the more sane Christians. Okay. They exist. Trust me, my brother stayed on this more conservative path. He was pretty much still on the party line. he gets a seminary degree. He learns all this. He learns Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic. He knows all this stuff. Incredibly smart guy, by the way. And he moves to China. And now in China, there's several things going on. Number one, he is no longer in an environment where anybody can control what he thinks or where he does or where he goes or anything. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing, he's now in his late 20s and he's starting to grow up. Okay. Number three, he's got access to the internet and all the stuff combines together. He's like, hey, wait a minute. The earth isn't 6,000 years old. There's no way. Like, there's stars 100 million light years away and you can see them. Like, they're at least 100 million years old. Okay. Like this kind of stuff. Right. And so this whole thing, he had been given this spreadsheet of exact answers of this is how everything is. And that spreadsheet started unraveling. Right. And so he's in this crisis of faith, and being a missionary in China, by the way, is rather difficult. You know, and so he was there for 4 years, and about 2 years in, man, this whole thing just started unraveling. And so at the end of 4 years, he's going to come home. I go to visit him. I take my daughter, like, hey, I got to see. I love China, by the way. I've been there 5 times. I have 2 adopted kids from China now. Wow. I go to see Brian, and we get in this argument. And we've been arguing about this for a long time. The emails have been going back and forth. And like I said, he is very smart. Like, you have not, I thought I had seen everything. I hadn't. You have not had a religious debate until you've had it with a seminary grad who had 4 years of Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic and knows where all the bones are buried. He knows where all the fault lines are. He knows all the texts and everything. And so we're arguing, and I'm kind of drowning. And all of a sudden, I kind of retreat to my comfort zone because I'm an engineer. And I say to Brian, look at the hand at the end of your arm. I said, this is a fine piece of engineering. I mean, and I'm an engineer. This is a really fine piece of engineering. I go, you don't think this is an accumulation of random accidents, do you? And he goes, hold on. And he's got this whole answer, which everybody's heard. No, you just need mutations and selection and millions of years, and you don't need a designer, right? Which is the standard line. And I'm like, and I sat there and I listened to that, and I said, you know what? If you get down to the core of the core of the core, I have an intuition, but I don't actually know. And, you know, those biologists might know something that an engineer doesn't. So you know what? I'm going to stop arguing with him about this right now. But I think he just touched a nerve. This is a major question. This is a major question. I have never been down this rabbit hole. I'm going to find out. When I go home from China, I'm going to start buying books and I'm going to start reading papers. I am scientifically literate. I have an engineering degree. I can read a scientific paper. I'm going to find out. And I am going to get to the bottom of this. And you know, maybe I'll be an atheist when this is all done. Or maybe I won't. I don't know. But here we go. And it was like leaping into a dark chasm and not having any idea where you're going to land. It was terrifying. It's like, okay, here we go. Maybe Thanksgiving dinner will come and everybody will be praying and Brian and I will be smirking at each other like they're talking to their invisible friend, Brian. So, you know, there we go. And wow. and so that was 14 years ago that conversation happened, and it plunged me down a rabbit hole. I had no idea how fascinating this was going to be, because it kept getting more interesting and more interesting and more interesting. And there kept being more and more things that nobody had ever told me. Like, why isn't anybody talking about this? Why is anybody talking about that? Why is this whole issue being compressed down to these little bumper sticker talking points when in fact this is like the most amazing thing I've ever seen? So I actually made major changes in my beliefs about history and science and evolution and everything. I mean, I certainly wasn't an evolutionist when I went into this conversation. I didn't really buy the evolutionary story. What I found out was, no, evolution is true, and it's so much more amazing than what anybody told you. what cells are actually doing when they evolve. Like cells evolve in real time. For example, just the other day, I mean, this just came out. It might be 2 days old. The story came out where I forget the guy's name, but there was an astronaut that was in space for a year.
Yeah, Kelly. His last name's Kelly, right?
Yeah. Okay. And they were sampling his DNA in space flight, and then they sampled his DNA after he got home, and they sequenced it to see what happened. The entire DNA of his body changed in response to the different levels of oxygen, the different levels of stress, the different kinds of exercise and physical activity. Literally changed his DNA. And then when he came home, it changed again, and it seems to have changed permanently. Okay, now we're talking about every cell in his body. We're not just talking like the cells in his testicles or something, okay? We're talking a complete physiological change coordinated among all cells in his whole entire body, okay? And see, what they tell you in most of the textbooks is that it's really simple. There's genes, and they build cells, and like that's it. No. The genes do build the cells, but the cells edit the genes. Okay? And it's like, it's this circular. You ever seen the MC Escher drawing where the hand is drawing a hand?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
It's like that. Life re-engineers itself. And it's almost hard to imagine how this actually works. I mean, you can begin to understand why people don't really get this. But we have known this since the 1940s. We have known for a fact that cells and organisms re-engineer their DNA in response to stress. And so when things start happening, they'll actually cut, splice, edit, move around, kind of like a Microsoft Word document where you're editing and you're moving stuff around. Cells do this. This is how bacteria engineer resistance to antibiotics. This is why we have an antibiotic crisis right now, where they're really seriously terrified that, well, we're going to have some Ebola that's going to, come out, and nobody's going to be able to kill it because none of the antibiotics work anymore. This is the kind of stuff that we're up against, and it's because these things are smart. And so if you could summarize my book in 2 sentences, it's Darwinists underestimate nature and creationists underestimate God, right? So when I was a creationist, like they taught me when I grew up, the earth is 6,000 years old, and, and all these animals were just, by the way, the Bible never says that God beamed the zebra out of the sky, Star Trek style, and it suddenly appeared munching grass. It says, let the ground produce animals. That's what it says. Like there's nothing in the biblical story that precludes evolution. I'm still a devout Christian. If you actually read it, go read it. Mm-hmm. It doesn't give you any idea how the animals were made or anything. Okay. But which is more sophisticated? Tell me which is more impressive. We're going to beam a zebra out of the spaceship, and it's going to appear munching grass on the savannah on a Tuesday afternoon. Okay. Or it starts with a cell, and the cell divides and adapts and adapts and adapts everywhere these creatures go, everywhere they are, 24/7, 365 days a year for millennia. They're adapting to stress, just like entrepreneurs do, just like football teams do, just like Google advertising does. And, millions of years later, you have zebras and you have giraffes and you have turtles and you have a whole ecosystem and you have a whole savanna that's all interconnected. Which is more impressive?
Well, if I'm sitting for one day, though, and I see a zebra come out of the sky and all of a sudden show up, that's pretty impressive. But if I can hang around for billions of years and watch them replicate, yeah. But so where does that cell come from?
Well, that's why I have a $5 million prize. Okay, so this is a whole nother piece of this.
Okay.
All right, so I'm a guy who writes an Ethernet book. And I'm looking at Ethernet packets, and I'm looking at genes and chromosomes. I'm going, these are almost exactly the same. It's almost scary. Wow. And I go, well, there's 1 million codes, HTML and barcodes and zip codes and English and Chinese, and all these codes are designed. And then there's one code we don't know where it came from, and there's no codes that aren't designed. Well, gee, it kind of looks like DNA is designed. It would sort of look like the first cell was designed. And so this really interesting thing happened. So I gave this talk at the largest church in Chicago, Willow Creek, famous church. And my talk was called, "If You Can Read This, I Can Prove God Exists." So basically, after a year after my encounter with Brian, I've read all these books and all this kind of stuff. And I'm like, man, I got a killer design argument. DNA is a code. All the other codes are designed. It sure looks like DNA is designed. And so I go give this talk, and I recorded it. I put it on my website, and it kind of went viral. And so all of a sudden, there's all these atheists coming at me with pitchforks, and man, they're mad, man. They're really mad. And so I was like, well, let's see how good I can get at backing these guys into a corner. I was starting to enjoy this because I'm like, well, show me a code that's not designed. All you need is one, and then you've toppled my theory. And they never could do it. And I got drug. Eventually, I got drug onto the largest atheist website in the entire world at the time, which was called Infidels, and they had this giant discussion board. And this guy had gotten frustrated debating with me on my blog. And so he goes and he posts a link, and he says, "Hey, you guys, be nice to this Perry Marshall guy while you rip him to shreds." And I'm like,
okay.
oh no.
Yeah, thanks, buddy.
Oh no. Okay, dude. All right. I guess, we're either going to put up or shut up. So I go in there and I start defending myself. And there's like one of me and 50 of them.
Is this like on a forum?
Yeah, this is on a public discussion board.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So the whole world can see this, right?
Okay.
So it's Perry against like all these people. And I'm like, DNA is a code. All the codes are designed. Show me a code that's not designed. All you need is one. Here's the rules, blah, blah, blah. This went on for 7 years. It became the longest running, most viewed thread in the entire history of that website. And it just got bigger and bigger and bigger, and nobody could solve it. Well, to kind of fast forward a little bit, like I was totally defending myself. I was immune to their criticism, but there was a frustration. The frustration was that it would just go round and round in circles because nobody would really agree on the definitions. And suddenly it occurred to me, Perry, you need to tell them how to prove you wrong. Tell them exactly how to prove you wrong. So I wrote the specification and I put it up on my website, and I said, here's the deal. You show me a code that's not designed, you win, and I will write you a check for $10,000. And here's exactly what you got to do. If you can show me any code that nobody had to design, you go through these check boxes and get to the end and get the answer, I'll write you a check for 10 grand. And I was like, well, I wonder what's going to happen when I put that out there. And you know what happened?
What?
Silence.
Mm.
They all went dead. Like they just disappeared. It was like, okay. And I was like, wow, I had no idea that was actually going to work. My goodness. I've never seen this happen before. I've never seen a bunch of angry atheists with pitchforks in their hands, like shut up and leave. Wow, that's remarkable. Well, okay. So this is where in my opinion, this is where things actually get interesting. Because I sat there and I said, well, somebody might solve this. Maybe.
So they're trying to come up with code. Can you explain exactly what that means? That is not designed by someone.
Yeah. Okay. So, all right. So you make an acronym. Okay, like AJH stands for AJ Hawk. And the A stand, and the J stand, right?
Yeah.
And so we're always assigning meaning to things, right? And APPLE means a piece of fruit, right?
Yeah.
And ORANGE, right? And you could go down through any code or like HTML, like there's a command for bolding, putting text in bold or italics, right? And so you can always put it on a table, right? So this means that, this means that. In ASCII computer language, A is 100001 and B is 100010, right? It's a code. Well, there's a genetic code table. GGG makes glycine and AAA makes lysine. Same thing, okay? And so, all right, so these are symbolic relationships where the meaning is assigned. And what I'm saying is, all right, so all these things have a coding table and a decoding table. So if you can take rocks or snowflakes or warm ponds, lightning strikes, happy chemical accidents, anything, if you can get a code to come out of a bunch of chemicals, then you win. So here's what you got to do. So it's kind of technical, but it's not like you can't understand this, right? AJH means AJ Hawk, right? It's as simple as that. Well, nobody could ever figure out how to do that. And I said, no, what if there is a law of physics? What if there's something that we never discovered that can't explain this? We should be looking for it. And I also understood, there's something I understood that a lot of religious people don't understand is there's no scientist in the world that can say, God did it, that settles it, let's go out for lunch. In fact, let's have a 3-martini lunch. Right? A scientist has a job to do, and they have to do the job, and they can't just like capitulate to a God explanation.
There's an answer. There's an answer to every problem. Right.
And that's the most basic premise of science is that, well, there must be a reason, there must be an answer, there must be something that preceded this. And so I said, I am not trying to stick it to the scientists. I am not trying to slow down science. I'm only trying to keep everybody honest, because I'm tired of hearing these stories. Like I heard Richard Dawkins, world's most famous atheist, on a radio program, and somebody asked him, so where did life come from? And he goes, it was a happy chemical accident. Oh, you got to be kidding. Like, you can't call yourself a scientist and say life was a happy chemical accident. Are you serious? Like, and then they just went on as though nothing ever happened. I couldn't believe it. I was like, no, like, you got to solve this. And so one of my friends said, Perry, what you need to do is you need to take your $10,000 prize and make it a $10 million prize. Kind of like the X Prize for space flight, right? Peter Diamandis and all that.
Yeah.
And so that's what I did. I went and I got a private equity investment group together. I raised some money. We did all this legal stuff. We posted a prize on HeroX.com. So I don't know if your listeners would be familiar with the X Prize for space flight, where 20 years ago, this guy named Peter Diamandis, he was very frustrated with the state of affairs of government bureaucracy, how many billions of dollars it takes for NASA to do anything. And so he went and he got some money and he put out this $10 million prize. And he said, if somebody, a private company, not a public, not a government or anything, if a private company or individual can build a spacecraft that can fly twice in outer space in 2 weeks, we'll give them $10 million.
So did Elon Musk win that?
No, a team organized by Paul Allen, who's one of the founders of Microsoft, did it. Oh, and okay. Paul Allen spent $25 million to build a spaceship that won a $10 million prize.
Is Paul Allen even in the space race that's going on right now between Elon Musk and Virgin and all that?
I have no idea. I'm sure you could look it up, but
okay.
But think of the significance of that. Okay, somebody built a spacecraft that could do, a miniature version of what a space shuttle does for $25 million. I mean, that's a sane amount of money. That's not like hundreds of billions of dollars. It's like there's lots of people that have $25 million actually. And they proved like you don't have to have a giant government program to be in space. And so this unleashed all the stuff that you're talking about right now.
Oh, okay.
Right? It was like, hey, you know, like ordinary people can do this. This is not right. This is not out of reach, right? We don't need to spend billions and billions of tax dollars to make stuff like this happen. And so Peter Diamandis did this with $10 million, right?
Okay.
And I looked at that and I said, well, I think the origin of life problem in biology is kind of the same thing. They've spent hundreds of millions of dollars paying professors to research this. And I'm not against the research or anything, but they haven't gotten very far. I mean, it's one of the least successful fields in all of science. It has not made very much progress in the last 100 years. And I said, and plus, people just make up these stories. Well, there was this replicator and it made this RNA and it was by these warm ocean vents. And then eventually we got a cell. And like, it sounds good if you don't really stop and think about it too hard. But if you actually stop and think about it, there's all kinds of problems with it. I mean, there's legions of problems with it. And I said, I'm tired of hearing people make up these stories. And my idea of God is not threatened by whether God miraculously made a cell or not. That's not really how I define God in the first place. But what if we can figure this out? Like, what if we did figure it out? Well, it would be like AI, man. It would probably be worth a ton of money. I mean, how to get from chemicals to codes, you're getting some kind of programming without even having a programmer. Like, wouldn't Microsoft want to own that, or wouldn't Google or Facebook or Apple? Wouldn't somebody like that want their hands on that? So we put together this prize, and I announced it in August at Arizona State University. I have judges from Harvard, Oxford, and MIT. And like this is a real thing. It's called the Evolution 2.0 Prize. You can go to naturalcode.org and hey, if you can come up with a code that's not designed and we can patent it, we'll write you a check for $5 million and we'll partner you into our company because we're serious about this.
Wow. So how come some conservative conservative Christians say, how come sometimes I've talked to people and they don't want to know. They don't want to be proven wrong. I guess you're scared to question anything that God ever did, or question God because I look like a bad person or I'm a terrible guy.
Yes.
If I question anything, doesn't it make your faith that much stronger when you can pick it apart and it still holds up?
Well, yes, I've always believed that. And see, when I said that, you know, I'm on the plane home from China, I'm like, when I get home, I'm tearing into this. And I do not know where this is going to take me. It really was scary. Like, okay, I got a wife, I got kids, we go to church, you know, a Christian family. It all actually works pretty well, you know, and like,
and all of a sudden, Dad stopped showing up to church on Sunday.
Right, like, and like, you don't have to look very far to know that can wreak havoc on a whole family. And like, and you know, Brian's already wandered off into the weeds and I'm arguing with him about this. And so I'm scared that this whole thing's going to unravel. But I said, there's no way I can be dishonest with myself. Now, the truth is most people of faith, or I don't know most, at least a large minority, are secretly terrified that somebody's going to prove this whole thing wrong.
I agree.
Okay.
Yeah.
And they don't, it's like, just don't look at the monster under that bed. Just keep that thing at bay. Like, don't touch it. Don't look at it. You know, things are working, you know, to a degree, things are working. Don't mess with it. That's not a bad thing. Okay. But I had to know. And I said, I am going to follow the evidence wherever it leads. Okay. Now, I have to mention, you know, atheists are just as terrified. Okay. They really are. I mean, it runs both direct. This is reality is an equal opportunity offender.
Okay.
Reality is not afraid to offend anybody who believes anything. Okay? I call it the laboratory of reality. Okay? Because there's the should be world and then there's the is world. And the is world never exactly matches up to the should be world, right? Everybody's theory has a hole in it somewhere. It's always the case, right? So we're always questioning our assumptions. Okay. And so I just said, you know what? I believe I have this, even though I'm terrified of where this is going to go, I have this deeper belief that if I just follow the truth, that the truth, when you let the truth win, it's better. And you end up discarding stuff. You end up, I mean, I'm an entrepreneur, you know, you can product lines, you fire employees, you lose money on stuff. You make mistakes, you make blunders. You're in football, man. Like how many of your beliefs got challenged out on the field?
Yeah, every day, pretty much.
Right? I mean, yeah. And it's your head, like you're literally knocking heads. I mean, most of us aren't, but like, is that a good play or a bad play? Is that a good defensive strategy or a bad one? I mean, well, you don't find out until the laboratory of reality shows up, you know, and when a guy gets injured and he's laying there and, you know, you can see his breath in the air. It's like, well, at least he's alive. I guess we know he's alive. For now, he's alive.
Yeah.
Right. It's like, man, his beliefs got confronted. Right. And so you have to be willing to do this. But what this ended up doing was this took my conception of God from being like this big to being like this big. Like God is way bigger than the Ken Ham Noah's Ark people in Kentucky even imagine. Creationists underestimate God. Darwinists underestimate nature. Those cells are way smarter than your biology teacher ever told you. Okay. And that's like, so it's the yin and the yang. Like, and so this whole debate is two small-minded tribes fighting with each other over the heads of the confused people in the middle. You know, and whenever this comes up, everybody's like, oh no, this again.
I'm sure. Well, I give you credit that you weren't scared of the outcome. You basically turned it over to, said, I'm going to let the truth show me the way. I guess most people, yeah. I think, are too scared to find out no, ignorance is bliss. I'm cool to just hang out in my comfort zone.
Right. And look, hanging out in your comfort zone guarantees that you won't evolve. See, I think that evolution, first of all, evolution has this negative, sour, Darwinian stigma, right?
Are they allowed there's certain schools that either have to teach creationism or evolution, don't they? Public schools now, isn't there some kind of debate going on with young kids?
Oh, well, this has been going on for 100 years.
So they're not even allowed to acknowledge, like, if you teach creationism, you can't even acknowledge evolution in some schools.
Well, yeah, in a Christian school, right? So like Cedarville College in Ohio, which isn't terribly far from you, yeah. Somewhere down there, they teach young earth creationism, and their literature says we teach young earth creationism. It's like, we're going to keep your kids safe from the secular blah, blah, blah.
So what happens in that school, though, if I'm a kid and I raise my hand and I say, excuse me, I get it, I believe in God and everything, but the earth is not 6,000 years old. It is proven that it is much, much older. What does a teacher say to that kid?
Well, to be blunt, they have made up their own version of science. Okay. And like, it's really disturbing. Okay. Now, by the way, they're very right about certain things. It's like, there's certain things they have absolutely correct. Right. But then there's other things like the age, like there's this guy in my blog. I mean, he's been debating other people for like 2 years, and he believes in virtual history. He believes that because Jesus multiplied the loaves, and if you had studied the loaves under a microscope, you would know that they were multiplied 10 seconds ago, that the earth was the same way, and the geology can't tell you anything about the age of the earth. Okay, and literally, like, he's been sticking to this story for like 2 years, arguing with people on my blog, whatever. Okay, like I couldn't possibly, like, okay, dude, you're saying that like 99.999% of history is an illusion. Like, that's crazy, right? But anyway, but this is kind of what you get into, right? And it also gets very complex. Like, as soon as you wade into it, as far as I'm concerned, speed of light's all you need to know. But then on the other side, secular schools, they won't allow a smidgen of, you can't talk about God, you can't talk, like, there was a guy named Guillermo Gonzalez. He wrote a book about 10 or 15 years ago called The Privileged Planet, and he was a professor at Iowa State. And The Privileged Planet, it was this really interesting book, and it said things like, so really interesting coincidence is that the sun and the moon are the exact same size in the sky.
Mm-hmm. Oh, are they?
Which means eclipse. They are. It's why a solar eclipse has a perfect corona around the moon when, right.
That was this past summer we had the.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Makes sense.
The only reason that you get a absolutely perfect corona, and the only reason that eclipse only lasts for like a minute, is because the sun and the moon are the exact same size in the sky from the Earth's surface. And because of that coincidence, there's measurements you can make only during an eclipse about the corona that tells you certain things about the sun that you can only learn during an eclipse. And that's just one example of a whole bunch of things where he says, there's all these coincidences that allow the universe to be discoverable and studyable and make the earth habitable. And he goes, gee, isn't it interesting? I mean, doesn't this kind of look like there's some kind of a divine fingerprint on the universe? So he published this book. The secular professors at Iowa State had his head on a stick. They circulated a petition. They got 900 signatures, and they got him thrown out of Iowa State for writing that book. Even though all of his other research was good, he was a good scholar, he was a good professor, everything, they threw him out. They would have none of it. He wasn't even teaching it in his classes. He had just written the book. So, like, I'm telling you, these two, like, fiefdoms are just like, they hate each other.
It doesn't seem to be getting any better, though. It might be worse with the internet, because now Ken Ham can debate guys like Richard Dawkins, Dawkins is the one who died, right?
Stephen Hawking just died.
But Ken
Ham did debate Bill Nye. It was like,
that's what I saw
4 years ago.
I've seen that.
Right. And that was like two guys completely talking past each other. I mean, completely. Ken Ham's like, it says so in the word of God. But what most people don't know is that Bill Nye's version of evolution is like 40 years out of date.
Is it really?
It doesn't include. Yes, it is. It's abysmally out of date. If you, I dare you, anybody who doesn't believe me, buy Bill Nye's book and buy my book. Read both of them. And if you don't agree that I completely went light years ahead of Bill Nye, I'll buy both books back from you. Just open a support ticket at perrymarshall.com. I will refund you both books.
I love it. You throw challenges out there for everybody to try to prove you wrong.
Skin in the game. Everything I do is skin in the game. Okay. So this is why the $10,000 challenge worked. They're having this intellectual argument. I don't even like the word intellectual, really. It's kind of eggheads, but like, no, dude, come up with some proof and I'll write you a check. Come up with some proof. You might get a Nobel Prize for crying out loud, but don't make up a story, right? There's no skin in the game with your little story.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Wow. What about, so yeah, you mentioned Stephen Hawking. So he died recently. He's had some weird quotes or different things. What was he? Did you study him much, and are you familiar with his beliefs?
Well, you know what? I've got a book back here somewhere called "And God Created the Integers" by Stephen Hawking. I think Stephen Hawking cuts both ways. So let me give you two different pieces of Stephen Hawking. Okay. And like I know people who know him, knew him, respect the guy, but so I'll give you one thing I liked, one thing I didn't like. In the God Created the Integers book, he tells a story about Isaac Newton, and Isaac Newton worked out the gravity and like how the planets should orbit the sun and stuff, but his math didn't work perfectly. It almost worked, but basically like every few years the math would go off. And so Newton figured, well, I guess God must just push the planets back into place every few years or something, because his math said that they would go shooting off into space. And this other guy came along and he said, no, I think you need to work on your math. And he pushed the math further, and he figured out, no, actually, if you fix your math problems, God doesn't have to do any of that. It just runs. And Stephen Hawking was making a case for, let's not have God of the gaps arguments, which is what these things are called. Like when science can't work something out, you go, oh, I guess God must fix that every now and then, or I guess God must have just stuck his hand and did that. And I mean, he made a very good point, right? Because Newton had just kind of jumped to God as a endpoint explanation, like, well, this is what's going on, when really the way you need to use God is the ground of all being. God is the master reason why the universe is rational in the first place. And so I read that story and I said, he's got a great point there. I've got this $10,000 challenge there. I actually need to open my mind up to the possibility somebody might figure this out. And I need to think about what would the benefits be if somebody figured this out. And then I started to realize, well, if there's an answer to this, then it could help us with healthcare. It could help us with cancer. It could help us with AI. And okay, so there's a positive Stephen Hawking story. Now, there's another one though too, that I think is kind of negative. So Stephen Hawking flirted with faith for much of his life. He was married to an Anglican woman for a while. I know he would go to Bible studies and stuff like that. And during the 1990s, he was kind of in the middle. And he would write these books about, how the universe and the Big Bang and everything happened. And he'd say, okay, but what breathes fire into the equations? Okay, we can analyze how all this stuff works, but what made it all happen? He's kind of like, well, something had to make it all happen. There has to be some ultimate explanation. And so religious people were pretty comfortable with that, because we're like, well, yeah, ultimately you do have to have a higher power. But about 10 years ago, he just capitulated to atheism, and he wrote a book called The Grand Design. And in the book called The Grand Design, he said science is making philosophy obsolete. Okay, now I don't have time to unravel and untangle this. Science will never make philosophy obsolete. Philosophy is thinking about thinking. Philosophy is the whole study of what is real, what is good, and what is true. That's what philosophy is. What's real, what's good, what's true. And it's thinking about thinking. So how do I figure out what is real? How do I figure out what is good? How do I figure out what is true? Science cannot tell you certainly can't tell you what's good. Yeah. Science can't tell you anything about what's good. Okay? if you take a machine gun and you kill 100 kids in a daycare, science can only tell you how the bullets went into their bodies. It can't tell you whether it was a good idea or bad idea, because science has no such value system. But science operates within a philosophical framework, and what Stephen was doing in his book was giving a lot of bad philosophy about how you can get something from nothing without explaining it, and then shooting the philosophers in the head by saying that science has gotten rid of philosophy. And I think it was a terrible mistake. And in my opinion, the quality of Stephen Hawking's work declined significantly in the last 10 years. I think he did fantastic work before that, but I think his atheism actually hurt his science.
Okay, that's interesting. I might have to go read that book then. It's so you're right. It seems like a lot to try to decipher through all of his stuff. I have followed him from afar at times, and just what he was able to do with his crazy. What was the disease he had? Where he couldn't.
Lou Gehrig's disease.
Yeah. Is he have ALS? Is that Lou Gehrig's ALS? That's it?
Yes.
That's what he had? Okay, wow. Because didn't he invent like the computer that he speaks with his eyes almost?
I don't know, but I know he had a really amazing technology. And what impresses me about the guy was all of the mathematical calculations and stuff that this guy could obviously do just even his head or with whatever tools were available to him. Like, obviously just a brilliant guy. And you have to admire that. So I don't want to take anything away from that. But it speaks to the polarization that's in, science and religion and all that. I mean, it's difficult and tricky.
Yeah. People like to take a side and stick with that side. But Perry, I, wrap this thing up. I just want to thank you for your time, man. You really do, I'm gonna have to listen back to this and go through it and break it down and try to break it down step by step exactly what you're telling us. So I appreciate it, though, and I think I'm definitely gonna be following your work moving forward.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate the fact that you're just willing to go down these crazy rabbit holes and follow wherever it goes and tell the stories and I want to challenge people too. You could have a religious belief. You could have a belief about your business. You could have a belief about your relationship or your marriage or whatever. And, don't be afraid to challenge the beliefs, because the truth is always your friend. The truth is never your enemy.
I love it, man. The truth is always your friend. All right, Perry Marshall, thanks again, man. We'll talk to you soon.
AJ, great to be on your show. Thank you.
We're glad you could join us for today's conversation. After you subscribe to the show, head over to thehawkcast.com or reach out to AJ directly on Twitter at @officialAJHawk to recommend future guests that will help us inspire people to keep talking. Thanks again, and we look forward to speaking with you next time on the HawkCast.